Welcome back to our channel where we provide updates and undisclosed narratives on the royal family. We provide you with the exciting news: King Charles shocks after Parliament with royal intervention approved. This week, London faced an unprecedented constitutional crisis in British history after King Charles III's intervention in politics. The Queen summoned 5 senior cabinet officials to Buckingham Palace for a clandestine meeting circumventing long-standing Crown Parliament conventions instead of consulting the Prime Minister. The action has unsettled the government financial markets and the international community, igniting a political upheaval that jeopardizes Prime Minister Keir Starmer's administration and raises concerns about the survival of the British monarchy. The crisis has rapidly worsened over the last 72 hours, resulting in cabinet resignations, a decline in government poll ratings, and economic instability. The central confrontation is a monarch seemingly ready to assert his authority and a prime minister confronting an existential threat. Constitutional scholars, former officials, and political analysts are grappling with the enduring implications of a schism that exposed the UK's unwritten and sometimes tenuous governance principles. The instances have highlighted both the immediate political consequences and the UK's constitutional structure, which relies equally on convention and mutual restraint as on codified legislation. Yesterday afternoon was a pivotal moment in the crisis. Buckingham Palace sent royal vehicles to collect 5 cabinet members for an urgent, unforeseen meeting with the King, catching number 10 off guard. Foreign Secretary David Lammy, Defense Secretary John Healey, the Home Secretary, the Chancellor, and Lord Chancellor Alex Chalk were summoned. The monarch's selection of these great offices of state officials underscored the gravity of his intentions and signaled that the intervention targeted those wielding significant influence over national security, legal matters, and international affairs. Numerous sources from the palace and Whitehall said that the meeting was classified. Ministers at Buckingham Palace were reportedly instructed to surrender their electronic devices. No advisors or private secretaries were permitted, hence prominent legislators spoke with the president individually. The palace enhanced security measures, and reports indicate that a temporary electronic exclusion zone was established around the meeting to prevent digital eavesdropping. If accurately documented, such measures would indicate not just heightened secrecy, but also a deliberate effort to maintain the dialogue between the monarch and the ministers. In the approximately 90-minute discussion, the King directly and candidly interrogated the ministers over many government policy matters, including immigration and its social implications as reported by sources. This direct engagement in delicate political matters contravenes the established norm of the monarch being apolitical and adhering to the guidance of their ministers. Since the 18th century, the constitutional role of the sovereign has been symbolic and consultative, characterized by Bagehot's principles of the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, the right to warn, but not to direct or command. The emphasis on elected political policy presents significant issues about the distinction between private counsel and governmental intervention. Prime Minister Keir Starmer was informed about the meeting subsequent to its commencement. Within number 10 Downing Street, alarm and dread intensified. According to one source, the Prime Minister hurled his phone in anger across his office upon getting the summons, shattering a nearby framed photo. Notwithstanding media coverage of the dramatic particulars, the Cabinet Secretary and the government's senior legal advisors organized an urgent conference to evaluate the legality of the King's acts and devise a response. Downing Street failed to recognize the issue until subsequent to the occurrence, at which point political repercussions had started. The Prime Minister's office has refrained from commenting on the meeting, which several opponents see as indicative of strategic stagnation that permits the proliferation of rumors and competing narratives. This atypical disagreement started with Prime Minister Starmer's address 3 days before. The Prime Minister endeavored to galvanize his party's support and show fiscal resilience in the face of declining poll numbers and public discontent about an extended period of austerity. During a party convention, he condemned entrenched and excessive advantages and advocated for enhanced financial oversight across all national organizations. He said that No institution, regardless of its historical significance, should be immune to financial examination during a period of collective national sacrifice. The monarchy was not referenced, although the Prime Minister's views were evident to both the audience and the King. The address was seen as a precursor to a re-evaluation of the sovereign grant and the tax-exempt status of the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall, which provide the Queen and Prince of Wales with their autonomous revenues. For several listeners, the mention of historic institutions about financial examination suggested that even entrenched arrangements would be subject to review, which would inherently be alarming to people who cherish old advantages and prerogatives. Buckingham Palace responded promptly and resolutely. Shortly after the speech, the King's whole week of public engagements was annulled without justification. Anonymous palace insiders characterized a severe situation. The King engaged in almost 6 hours of urgent conversations with his senior advisers, notably Sir Clive Alderton, his private secretary. Edward Chapman, a former royal aide, described the palace as tense beyond description, arguing that such a rapid and intense response signified a fundamental line had been breached. The palace has always addressed delicate matters with care. Nonetheless, the magnitude and rapidity of this response indicate that the monarchy saw the speech as the beginning of a campaign that might significantly affect the institution's finances and prestige. This protocol, purportedly established to address substantial threats to the institution's integrity, initiated senior royal personnel under Operation Sovereign Defense. Although operational details remain undisclosed, a contingency plan generally necessitates coordinated efforts among private offices, legal advisors, communications teams, and public intervention logistics. This response started with a clandestine but resolute communication to the authorities. At 15:47 hours, the King had an impromptu meeting with Alex Chalk, the Lord Chancellor, the day before to the ministerial summons. 2 reports indicate that the King said, "The Crown cannot and will not remain silent while Parliament undermines the very foundations of our nation." The Lord Chancellor was allegedly taken aback by the King's rhetoric and promptly acknowledged its constitutional implications. This talk was then followed by a direct intervention involving the 5 cabinet members a few hours later. The King's actions have ignited a complex constitutional debate in Britain. Dr. Catherine Haddon, a senior fellow at the Institute for Government and a prominent constitutional authority, described the situation as deeply perilous. The monarch operates on the counsel of their ministers and refrains from involvement in partisan politics. By convening ministers without the Prime Minister's awareness to challenge experts, have drawn comparisons to past catastrophes, yet caution that none are identical. Historian and former Supreme Court Justice Jonathan Sumption described it as the most significant royal intervention into politics since the abdication crisis of 1936. He emphasized a crucial distinction. The 1936 crisis pertained to the monarch's private life and fitness for the position. This dilemma pertains to the monarch's direct confrontation with a democratically elected government about public policy. The royal prerogative, including the Crown's inherent rights, privileges, and immunities, is central to the issue. Although the monarch now exercises powers, including choosing a prime minister and granting royal assent to legislation based on the government's binding recommendations, their theoretical existence engenders a gray area that the King seems to be scrutinizing. Currently, prerogative powers are mostly used based on ministerial counsel according to conventions and political accountability. Yet mutual respect and discipline sustain these traditions. No constitutional court is permitted to adjudicate on a monarch's private deliberations, and Parliament's responses are political rather than judicial in nature. Legal scholars assert that the UK's uncodified system obscures the distinction between legitimate private actions by a sovereign and unacceptable governmental interference. Professor Helen Marsh, a constitutional lawyer at a prestigious university, stated, "The law imposes minimal direct restrictions on the sovereign's private expressions. The primary constraints are political. The government's legitimacy relies on an implicit agreement that the Crown will not replace its political judgment with that of ministers. Should the sovereign breach that restraint, Parliament, political pressure, and public opinion may intervene. King Charles has leveraged the social and economic upheaval stemming from the constitutional crisis. Recent statistics reveal that a significant portion of the UK's most vulnerable population is in distress. The Centre for Social Justice has reported that more than 2.8 million seniors reside below the poverty threshold, a figure that has consistently risen over the past 2 years. This data underscores a tangible decline in living standards affecting millions of families, heightening public consciousness regarding justice and governmental expenditure priorities. Personal narratives have underscored the individual ramifications of austerity. Following her disclosure to a local newspaper that her most recent energy bill consumed 43% of her monthly state pension, 78-year-old retired nurse Margaret Wilkinson from Sunderland emerged as a representative of this plight. "I served the NHS for 41 years, she stated. National attention has also been directed towards the hardships faced by war veterans. Portsmouth resident James Cooper, a veteran of the Northern Ireland and Falklands Wars, was found sleeping in his vehicle 3 nights a week due to his inability to afford rent and sustenance. He expressed, "I fought for this country, I was willing to die for it. And this is the gratitude I receive." These personal accounts render the social consequences of austerity both relatable and morally significant. These narratives are substantiated by concerning national statistics. Charitable organizations for the elderly report a 27% increase in suicides among individuals over 65 in the past 6 months, attributing this to financial distress and social isolation. Since January, retirees have augmented their reliance on food banks. These indicators reflect a society in distress, heightened loneliness, and mental health challenges diminishing secure retirement, and a belief that public institutions are failing to address essential human needs. Such conditions empower individuals, including the monarch, to assert moral authority as advocates for social justice. This pervasive suffering stands in stark contrast to governmental objectives and is politically harmful. Chauffeur-driven vehicles, first-class flights, and catered meals incurred a cost of $127 million for ministers in the previous fiscal year, as revealed by an analysis of public documents conducted by a taxpayer advocacy organization. Public indignation ensued following disclosures that Home Secretary Yvette Cooper expended $14,300 on office furnishings, while Culture Secretary Lucy Powell claimed $7,600 for leisure activities within a single month. Although these expenditures adhered to regulations, the perception was unfavorable for an administration focused on austerity. RMT General Secretary Mike Lynch stated, "This government has forsaken the working populace that elevated them to power. They have neglected their intended constituency." The contrast between public suffering and the evident privileges of political elites has incited popular outrage and offered political justification for prominent interventions presented as benevolent gestures. King Charles's subsequent and perhaps most calculated venture was into this delicate social landscape. In a remarkable display of political theater, the king orchestrated a surprise event at St. George's Hall in Windsor Castle. Optimal media impact was secured with a mere 30 minutes notice for royal correspondence. The timing and composition of the audience indicate a deliberate effort to create an emotional counter-narrative to the government's austerity message. The king delivered a succinct, fervent address to 24 war veterans and poverty advocates, speaking candidly without his entourage, a rarity for a British monarch. A nation that neglects its responsibilities to those who have served and sacrificed is a nation that has lost its moral compass. He stated, visibly emotional. He continued, "When our elderly who constructed the nation we inhabit today cannot afford both sustenance and warmth, and when our veterans endure homelessness on the very streets they pledge to protect, then a fundamental breach has occurred in Britain's social contract." This rhetorical framing connected the monarchy's moral authority to the struggles of vulnerable citizens, repositioning the crown as an active moral agent. The king subsequently initiated the Royal Compassion Initiative. He sanctioned the allocation of funds from his Duchy of Lancaster to provide emergency heating payments for 5,000 impoverished pensioners. Additionally, he declared that 3 vacant royal residences would be swiftly repurposed as shelters for homeless veterans. He committed $3.5 million to a coalition of organizations dedicated to assisting the elderly and veterans to launch the initiative. Notably, these actions were unilateral and lacked governmental approval. The monarch's private charitable endeavors, funded by his estates and resources, enabled him to operate independently of ministers in accordance with the law. The endeavor was termed a masterclass in soft power by seasoned royal commentator Peter Hunt. The king may bypass the constitutional prohibition on governmental policy through extensive personal philanthropy. The crown emerged as the empathetic advocate for the populace, addressing a void of compassion created by governmental inaction. Private charitable initiatives can be framed as expressions of personal ethics rather than political involvement, yet the political ramifications are frequently indistinguishable. Analysts observed the event's meticulous choreography. Veterans and retirees possessing bipartisan support were deliberately selected as the initiative's representatives. Following the Prime Minister's address that contested historic privileges, the timing aimed to underscore the Crown's ethical standing and the government's fiscal positioning. Favorable reports of veterans embracing the king and pensioners receiving symbolic heating vouchers on social media eclipsed adverse critiques concerning constitutional legitimacy in the hours subsequent to the event. The political impact was immediate. Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg remarked, "His Majesty has exhibited more compassion in a single afternoon than the entire Labour front bench has shown since assuming office." The king outmaneuvered the prime minister, redirecting the national dialogue from his constitutional transgressions to the government's ethical shortcomings. He reoriented public discourse towards social equity and pressing aid rather than the constitutional principles his private meetings had breached. The conflict precipitated immediate and significant economic and political ramifications. International financial markets, which prioritize stability, reacted with alarm to constitutional ambiguity. The king's actions resulted in a 4.7% depreciation of the pound sterling against the US dollar within 6 hours. As investors divested from London, the FTSE 100 index plummeted by 273 points in a single day. Morgan Stanley issued an urgent advisory to clients regarding unprecedented constitutional uncertainty in the UK. Government bond yields reflecting the interest rate the government incurs to borrow funds surged to a 15-year high, signaling a dramatic decline in investor confidence in the nation's economic and political governance. Investors are apprehensive that political instability could undermine fiscal credibility, impede investment, and complicate public debt management. Market experts indicated that prolonged uncertainty could yield enduring repercussions. Elevated government borrowing costs would constrict already limited budgets, necessitating challenging choices between public services and debt obligations. Pension funds and insurers vulnerable to sovereign credit and market fluctuations encountered valuation pressures that could undermine consumer confidence. Currency traders reassessed London as a capital hub following the evident collapse of constitutional norms, while the Bank of England convened emergency sessions with financial regulators and major banks to evaluate systemic risks. The Labour administration is imploding due to the crisis. 3 junior ministers quit quickly. First Transport Minister Louise Hayes' resignation letter leaked publicly. It said, "I cannot in good conscience serve in a government that places itself in direct opposition to both the Crown and the most vulnerable in our society. The party is in disarray." A WhatsApp group called Damage Control, which swiftly swelled to 47 backbenchers, expressed significant concern over the government's crisis response. Downing Street reports senior cabinet ministers arguing at length. During a confrontation with the Prime Minister's communications director, Chief Whip Mary Kelly allegedly shouted, "This is political suicide and I won't be part of it." Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner was overheard telling a colleague that the Prime Minister had completely lost the plot. These internal ruptures show how quickly political discipline can break down when the party's public standing deteriorates and core principles are. The opposition has been fervent as well. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch called for an emergency parliamentary debate and an investigation into the government's reckless approach to constitutional change. Party members capitalized on her rhetoric, while certain conservatives privately cautioned against intensifying a confrontation that could jeopardize the crown or destabilize the nation. The party's right wing, perceiving an electoral opportunity, advocated for the king on social media and at constituency events. The global reaction has been concerning. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's tweet referring to King Charles as a true leader standing up for real British values heightened uncertainty. The direct diplomatic ramifications were more pronounced. French President Emmanuel Macron contacted Prime Minister Starmer to convey his apprehensions regarding UK stability, while German Chancellor Olaf Scholz annulled a state visit to Britain, citing the current constitutional situation. These diplomatic actions indicate that the crisis extends beyond the UK. Partners and allies are evaluating the implications for bilateral cooperation, defense obligations, trade relations, and the broader context. Europe and Washington meticulously monitored developments, with officials discreetly cautioning that the uncertainty within the British government could impede collaborative security strategies and long-term procurement agreements. NATO officials, though reticent, cautioned that any perceived erosion of civil-military standards or the autonomy of elected governance could present operational challenges. Within the Commonwealth, where the British monarch serves as a state symbol in numerous nations, measured statements emphasized the importance of democratic processes and constitutional stability. Domestically devolved governments expressed alarm. A pro-independence First Minister led the Scottish government in a robust assertion questioning the impartiality of a monarch who intervenes in UK politics regarding nations contemplating constitutional futures. The Welsh and Northern Irish governments sought immediate clarification and proposed a cross-party assembly to discuss devolution amidst the turmoil. In Holyrood and Cardiff Bay, opposition members utilized parliamentary sessions to request guidance on ceremonial protocols and assurances that the matter would not jeopardize devolved powers. Consequently, the crisis has intensified conflicts surrounding devolution and constitutional identity in Scotland, prompting calls for an expedited independence referendum. Public sentiment seemingly aligned with the monarchy. A rapid YouGov poll revealed that 68% of Britons endorsed the King's participation. Concurrently, the Labour Party's approval rating plummeted from 43% to 31%. Within critical electoral demographics, over 60 Labour's support diminished to 17%. Citizens gathered impromptu outside Buckingham Palace, brandishing Union flags and singing "God Save the King," demonstrating a pronounced display of popular solidarity. Public opinion polls and spontaneous demonstrations have provided substantial momentum to advocates for Crown involvement. The increase in royal endorsement has astonished political analysts who anticipated that younger, more progressive individuals would vehemently resist royal initiatives. Contrary to this expectation, the King's meticulously crafted rhetoric, rooted in compassion for pensioners and veterans, elicited an immediate and emotional reaction from diverse socioeconomic groups. Observers noted that the monarchy retains popularity and legitimacy among significant segments of the populace transcending political affiliations. The leakage of a highly sensitive Cabinet Office document intensified the situation as the administration sought to address it. A 47-page report from 2 weeks prior was disclosed to The Telegraph and The Times. The document, titled "Constitutional Modernization Scenarios and Frameworks," appears to contain the Prime Minister's office's confidential polling and strategic planning regarding the abolition of the monarchy. The document purportedly analyzes public backing for a republic and suggests timelines and legal frameworks to supplant the monarchy with an elected government over a span of 15 years. It may encompass the Constitutional Modernization Act and draft legislative provisions representing a significant political upheaval. It indicates that despite ostensibly pledging loyalty to the Crown, the Starmer administration was actively contemplating the termination of a millennium of monarchy. This revelation may elucidate the King's vigorous engagement, reframing it as a safeguard against an existential threat rather than merely a verbal reaction. Downing Street vehemently refutes claims that the documents are a fabrication. 3 journalistic sources assert their authenticity. The opposition has capitalized on the disclosure. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch called for an emergency debate at a press conference outside Parliament, stating, "The British people deserve to know if their government is secretly plotting to undermine our constitutional monarchy," and urged a formal inquiry into constitutional sabotage. The leak has intensified suspicions, exacerbated institutional mistrust, and ignited demands for parliamentary oversight. The political ramifications of the release are complex. Centrist and Blairite Labour members expressed dismay that the party's bureaucracy could contemplate such radical reform without public consultation. Confidential government research disclosed strategic recklessness, alarming Labour activists, particularly those on the Republican left. Public trust in government hinges on perceived transparency concerning fundamental institutional changes. Thus, any appearance of misleading the public about constitutional identity carries significant credibility consequences. The instability of the Labour and Conservative parties has engendered a political vacuum that other parties are rapidly occupying. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage has adeptly capitalized on this situation, visiting working-class villages in northern England with a compelling message: the political elite has abandoned the populace, and only he aligns himself with the monarchy. His rallies experienced a 4-fold increase in attendance overnight. He addressed nearly 5,000 individuals in Barnsley, a Labour bastion. "Some politicians serve themselves, others serve their party," Farage articulated to his Hartlepool supporters. "The King serves the nation." This populist narrative, juxtaposing a supposedly self-serving elite with a custodian of national identity, has resonated with the disillusionment reflected in recent surveys. Recent polls indicate a significant political shift. Reform UK's national support has increased to 24%, trailing the Conservatives by 7 points. Notably, the party is leading in numerous constituencies that Labour reclaimed in the last election. For the first time, Reform UK is regarded as a credible contender for power, potentially supplanting one of the 2 dominant parties. The fragmentation of the traditional party framework may influence future governmental stability and coalition formation within a first-past-the-post electoral system. Election analysts express concern that the current turmoil may intensify long-term realignment. Reform UK could potentially establish a populist coalition of disillusioned Labour and Conservative constituents, rendering legislative majorities uncertain. This would complicate the ability of governments to secure stable majorities for significant constitutional reforms, including efforts to elucidate or formalize conventions under duress. The United Kingdom is currently experiencing a constitutional crisis. The nation's future hinges on the forthcoming days. The emergency constitutional crisis deliberation in Parliament is expected to be rife with accusations and political stratagems. An unprecedented national broadcast by the King is scheduled for 8:00 p.m., with royal insiders deeming it the most significant speech of his reign. Concurrently, 29 out of 35 dissenting Labour MPs have endorsed a leadership challenge against Keir Starmer. The complexities surrounding this challenge, timing for a vote, internal party electoral procedures, and potential factional divisions heighten political uncertainty. Military forces in London are on alert, and the Metropolitan Police have rescinded the weekend leave of senior officers, signaling underlying tensions. These measures aim to preserve public order amid significant protests or political instability, reflecting the authorities' serious approach to potential upheaval. Defense leaders have received assurances from ministers regarding the legal maintenance of civil power. Officials emphasized that the military remains apolitical and that any deployment would occur under civilian oversight. However, the presence of soldiers on the capital's streets conveys an impression of a nation bracing for turmoil. The situation presents limited legal and politically complex solutions. Parliament may hold the monarch accountable through motions of censure reductions to the sovereign grant or legislative reforms to curtail residual prerogatives. However, these actions necessitate enduring parliamentary cohesion and political capital amid precarious alliances. Prominent constitutional scholars advocate for a swift bipartisan consensus to codify fundamental principles into law to delineate royal prerogative. Conversely, some express concern that legislating the monarch's permissible obligations could be unpopular and result in protracted judicial and democratic disputes. The Privy Council, which provides legal counsel to the sovereign and fulfills constitutional responsibilities, is perceived as an intermediary. Senior palace officials contemplated convening a meeting of privy councillors to contextualize the king's actions within a formal consultative framework. However, the council's contemporary function is predominantly ceremonial and advisory, lacking the political legitimacy that must be negotiated between elected bodies and the crown. Some analysts have proposed the option of withholding royal assent, a legally permissible action in exceptional circumstances, yet politically detrimental and unused for generations. International observers have recognized the distinctive vulnerability of the UK's uncodified constitution in such circumstances. Britain depends on common conventions in contrast to countries with codified constitutions that limit the authority of the head of state. When leaders interpret these conventions divergently or political circumstances encourage violations, such understandings can swiftly collapse. The crisis has rekindled a previously academic debate regarding the necessity of codifying the UK's constitution to prevent future failures. Events have produced diverse impacts on individuals. Pensioners and veterans selected through the King's Initiative will receive emergency heating subsidies and temporary accommodation to alleviate significant distress. Charitable organizations acknowledged the assistance but expressed skepticism regarding enduring systemic solutions to structural poverty. Caroline Mansfield, director of a veterans charity, stated, "The support is critically necessary and will preserve lives this winter. However, we cannot depend on sporadic philanthropy to rectify persistent policy deficiencies." Such assertions underscore the tension between humanitarian advantages and the potential normalization of social objectives devoid of democratic oversight. Prime Minister Starmer confronts a challenging political dilemma. He must uphold the legitimacy of the elected government, reassure financial markets and international allies, and restore confidence within his parliamentary party while addressing the authentic socio-economic issues that necessitated the king's intervention. He could opt for an immediate general election to pursue a renewed mandate, a precarious choice given declining poll numbers, or consolidate his position by implementing decisive policy measures on pensions and veterans' support to diminish the monarchy's moral authority. A third, more politically intricate alternative involves publicly initiating dialogue with the palace to establish a public protocol delineating expected boundaries and a swift package of social initiatives to counteract the king's moral stance. The risk has garnered the king extensive support and moral legitimacy. Long-term dangers persist. Ongoing political engagement by the monarch threatens to establish a new divisive role for the crown, potentially exposing it to legislative constraints or transforming it into a partisan emblem rather than a unifying presence. Intervening to provide assistance may have yielded immediate reputational benefits, yet it has also ignited a constitutional discourse that could jeopardize the monarchy's autonomy and dignity. Each action is exaggerated by media. Traditional broadcasters and newspapers hastily analyze intentions and precedents, while social media intensifies unfiltered emotions, misinformation, and calls to action. Within hours of the king's address, counterfeit articles and altered images proliferated across platforms, complicating mainstream media's coverage. Technology companies were urged to eliminate objectionable content and highlight inaccuracies, yet the rapidity of digital communication ensures narratives persist in public consciousness despite refutation. Civic and labor organizations conveyed conflicting messages. Certain trade unions criticized the Prime Minister's austerity rhetoric while endorsing poverty alleviation initiatives, whereas others cautioned against undermining democracy. The Trades Union Congress advocated for tranquility and an expedited governmental response to elderly poverty, underscoring the necessity of addressing constitutional issues within Parliament. Students and younger activists who had formerly opposed the monarchy conducted subdued protests to safeguard democratic principles and voiced concerns that a politicized crown could suppress progressive movements. Operational disruptions corresponded with economic consequences. Officials sought clarification regarding the continuity of authority, postponing significant public sector procurement decisions. International infrastructure investors in the UK demanded expedited risk assessments from politicians and authorities. Market apprehension heightened as a major pension fund suspended new UK asset allocations pending sovereign credit developments. The crisis has revealed a troubling fragility in a constitutional arrangement predicated on mutual respect and implicit norms for centuries, irrespective of immediate tactical actions such as emergency debates, public addresses, resignations, or disclosures. Britain's overarching concern is whether its unwritten constitution, adaptable in tranquil periods and pliable across generations, can endure a conflict between crown and elected government. Will political actors reinstate ministerial governance, or will the schism result in significant transformation, codification, or a re-evaluation of the monarchy's position in British public life? In the forthcoming hours and days, inquiries will be resolved. The emergency deliberation in Parliament, the King's address, and the reactions of foreign allies, markets, and the electorate will determine whether Britain can recuperate or if the current crisis will mark a pivotal moment in governance. Snap elections, cross-party agreements, and constitutional conferences may be formalized. Britain is currently experiencing a profound disruption of its political foundations. This matter has transcended mere political discourse and has reached a critical juncture for the Crown Parliament and the populace. The outcomes will influence Keir Starmer's cabinet, King Charles's reign, and the constitutional practices of the UK. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, and share it.